On September 26, 1941, the largest military encirclement in human history came to a devastating end. In the forests and fields around Kiev, over 665,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in what would become one of the Red Army's darkest hours. This is not a story of glory. This is a story of how strategic stubbornness, political ideology, and military miscalculation combined to create an unparalleled catastrophe. This is the story of the Battle of Kiev, told through the eyes of the soldiers who fought there, the commanders who tried to save them, and the leadership that doomed them. This is the story of the largest trap ever set in warfare, and the men who walked into it knowing they might never walk out. June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m. Along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, over 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft smashed into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, had begun. For the Soviet Union, the attack was catastrophic, despite not being entirely unexpected. Stalin had received dozens of warnings about German preparations, but he had dismissed them all, convinced that Hitler would not attack until Britain was defeated. The Red Army was in the middle of a massive reorganization and expansion. Millions of men were under arms, but they were poorly trained, poorly led, and positioned for offensive operations, not defense. Within hours, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground. German Panzer spearheads sliced through Soviet border defences, exploiting gaps and surrounding entire armies before they could react. Communications collapsed, supply lines were cut, entire units simply vanished. The initial phase of Barbarossa was a masterclass in mobile warfare. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad. Army Group Centre smashed through Byelorussia toward Moscow. And Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, pushed into Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union and the location of vital industrial centres. For the average Soviet soldier in Ukraine, those first days were chaos incarnate. Many had been awakened by German artillery fire, still in their barracks. Orders contradicted each other, or never arrived at all. Units retreated, advanced, retreated again, often without knowing where the enemy actually was. German aircraft seemed to own the sky, strafing columns of troops and vehicles at will. The Wehrmacht's tactics were devastatingly effective. Panzer divisions would punch through Soviet lines, then race deep into the rear, encircling entire armies. Following infantry would seal the pocket while the tanks raced forward to create new encirclements. The Soviets called it Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. By early July, Army Group South had crossed the old Soviet border and was driving deeper into Ukraine. Despite fierce resistance in some sectors, Soviet forces were reeling. Entire armies had been encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been killed or captured. But amidst this catastrophe, one major city still held: Kiev. Kiev, the mother of Russian cities. Founded over 1,500 years ago on the banks of the Dnieper River, it was the ancient heart of Kievan Rus, the medieval state from which Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus all claimed descent. By 1941, it was a major Soviet city of 850,000 people, an industrial powerhouse and a symbol of Ukrainian Soviet pride. And it was exactly the kind of place Stalin could never allow himself to surrender without a fight. The defense of Kiev fell to the southwestern front, commanded by Marshal Semyon Budyonny, a legendary cavalry commander from the Russian Civil War. Budyonny was 58 years old, a hero of the revolution, and one of Stalin's oldest comrades. He was also completely out of his depth in modern mechanized warfare. The actual field command was held by General Mikhail Kirponos, a more capable and professional officer. Kirponos commanded 5 armies totaling over 700,000 men, the largest concentration of Soviet forces anywhere on the Eastern Front. These included the 5th, 21st, 26th, 37th and 38th Armies, positioned in a roughly semicircular defence around Kiev and along the Dnieper River. On paper, it was an impressive force. In reality, it was a fragile one. Many units had already been battered in the initial German onslaught. Regiments that should have numbered 3,000 men might have only 1,500. Tank brigades had lost half their vehicles. Artillery battalions were short on ammunition. The troops themselves ranged from hardened veterans to raw recruits who had barely finished training. Morale was complicated. Some units maintained excellent discipline and fighting spirit, especially those led by competent officers. Others were demoralized by the constant retreats and the apparent invincibility of the German war machine. Officers whispered among themselves, how could the mighty Red Army, which had crushed the Whites in the Civil War and defeated the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol, be falling apart so quickly? The answer was complex. Poor leadership at the highest levels. The devastating purges of the late 1930s, which had killed or imprisoned thousands of experienced officers. Outdated tactics and doctrine, inadequate training, communication problems, supply shortages. But despite everything, Kiev held. Through July and into August, the southwestern front maintained its positions. German forces probed the defences but couldn't break through. Army Group South was making slower progress than the other German army groups, bogged down by Soviet resistance and the vast distances of Ukraine. Soviet soldiers dug trenches and bunkers. They laid minefields and constructed anti-tank obstacles. Civilians, including thousands of women, worked alongside soldiers to build fortifications. The mood in the city was tense but determined. If the Germans wanted Kiev, they would have to pay for it in blood. For a brief moment in August, there was even hope. Maybe the German advance could be stopped here. Maybe the tide could be turned. That hope was an illusion. In Moscow, Stalin and his high command faced impossible choices. By mid-August, Army Group Center had driven to within 300 kilometers of Moscow. German panzers had taken Smolensk. The capital itself seemed threatened. Should all available reserves be rushed to defend Moscow? Or should they be used to reinforce other sectors? And what about Kiev? The arguments in Stalin's office were heated. Present were some of the most important military figures in Soviet history. Georgy Zhukov, the chief of the General Staff, Boris Shaposhnikov, the brilliant strategist, Semyon Timoshenko, the defense commissar, and others. Zhukov argued forcefully for abandoning Kiev. His strategic assessment was clear and damning. The southwestern front was vulnerable to encirclement. German forces were massing on both flanks. The position was becoming untenable. If the troops withdrew now, they could form new defensive lines further east. The armies could be saved to fight another day. But Stalin saw things differently. To understand Stalin's mindset, we must understand the man and his worldview. Stalin was not a military professional. He was a revolutionary who had come to power through political cunning and ruthless violence. During the Civil War, he had defended Tsaritsyn, later Stalingrad, and believed his stubborn defense had won the day. He had little patience for defeatist talk from generals suggesting retreat. Moreover, there were practical considerations. Every kilometre of Soviet territory lost meant resources lost: factories, farms, raw materials. Ukraine was the breadbasket of the USSR. It produced enormous quantities of grain, coal, iron and steel. Losing Kiev meant losing even more of Ukraine's industrial capacity. There were also political and psychological factors. Kiev was not just any city, it was a powerful symbol. To abandon it without a major battle would be a propaganda disaster. It might encourage the Germans, it might undermine morale across the entire Red Army. Stalin remembered how the loss of cities during World War I had contributed to the collapse of the Tsarist regime. He would not let that happen to Soviet power. And finally, there was Stalin's nature. He did not forgive weakness. He did not reward caution. Generals who suggested retreat were defeatists, possibly traitors. This mindset had been reinforced by his purge of the military in 1937 to 1938, when tens of thousands of officers were arrested and executed on charges of conspiracy and treason. The survivors had learned a harsh lesson: better to die fighting than to be accused of cowardice. On August 29th, the debate reached its climax. Zhukov pressed once more for withdrawal from Kiev. Stalin exploded. He accused Zhukov of talking nonsense and relieved him of his post as Chief of the General Staff on the spot. Zhukov was sent to command the Reserve Front, essentially a demotion and a warning to other generals about the price of defeatism. The decision was final. Kiev would be held. The Southwestern Front would maintain its positions. There would be no retreat. Zhukov left Stalin's office knowing what this meant. He would later write in his memoirs, "I was certain that a catastrophe was inevitable." Meanwhile, at the Southwestern Front headquarters in Kiev, General Kirponos and his staff watched the situation deteriorate with growing alarm. They could see what Moscow apparently could not. The Germans were preparing something big. While Stalin and his generals argued in Moscow, German commanders were planning the largest encirclement operation in military history. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential. Two massive panzer forces would execute a double envelopment, a pincer movement on a colossal scale, cutting off the entire southwestern front. From the north, Panzer Group II, commanded by General Heinz Guderian, would drive south. From the south, Panzer Group I, under General Ewald von Kleist, would drive north. They would meet somewhere east of Kiev, closing the trap on over 700,000 Soviet soldiers. The architect of this plan was not initially focused on Kiev at all. Army Group Center's commander, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, wanted his panzers to drive straight for Moscow. Guderian's tanks had already thrust deep toward the Soviet capital, and von Bock believed Moscow could be taken before winter. But Hitler intervened. He was convinced that economic targets, Ukraine's resources and industry, were more important than Moscow. He ordered Guderian's Panzer Group II to turn south, away from Moscow, to link up with Army Group South in a giant encirclement of the Soviet forces around Kiev. Guderian protested. He believed the turn south was a strategic mistake that would cost Germany the chance to take Moscow in 1941. But Hitler's orders were final. By late August, the pieces were moving into position. Guderian's panzers turned south, their long columns of tanks and vehicles stretching across the Ukrainian landscape. To the south, Kleist's Panzer Group I began its drive north. From the Soviet perspective, the signs of the impending disaster were everywhere, for those who were allowed to see them. Soviet reconnaissance units reported German tank concentrations in unexpected places. Radio operators intercepted German communications indicating major movements. Aerial reconnaissance, when it could be conducted, spotted long columns of vehicles moving toward the flanks of the Southwestern Front. At Southwestern Front headquarters, staff officers plotted these reports on their maps and saw the pattern emerging. They drafted urgent reports to Moscow, warning of the danger. They requested permission to withdraw before it was too late. Moscow's response was consistent and unequivocal. Hold your positions. Prepare for counterattacks. there will be no retreat. Some historians have debated whether Stalin genuinely didn't understand the danger, or whether he understood but refused to accept the implications. Perhaps he believed that the southwestern front could hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Perhaps he thought the Germans were bluffing, that their forces were too stretched to execute such a massive encirclement. Perhaps he simply couldn't bring himself to authorize what would look like a humiliating defeat. Whatever Stalin's reasoning, the result was the same. The southwestern front would stay where it was, and the German pincers would close. By early September, the trap was ready to spring. German forces began their final preparations. Artillery was brought forward. Luftwaffe units were concentrated to provide air support. Infantry divisions were positioned to follow the panzers and seal the pocket. The largest encirclement in military history was about to begin. And the men of the southwestern front, still holding their positions around Kiev, had no idea what was coming. September 10th, 1941. The attack began. From the north, Guderian's Panzer Group II smashed through the Soviet 41st Army's defences and raced southward. 3 panzer divisions and 2 motorised divisions drove deep into the Soviet rear, their tracks churning up the dusty Ukrainian roads. From the south, Kleist's Panzer Group I broke through the Soviet 38th Army and pushed north with similar speed and violence. For the Soviet units in the path of these attacks, it was overwhelming. German combined arms tactics, tanks, motorized infantry, dive bombers, and artillery working in perfect coordination shattered defensive positions before they could properly organize resistance. Radio reports flooded into Southwestern Front headquarters. Germans have broken through in strength. Enemy tanks in our rear. We are being encircled. Request permission to withdraw. General Kirponos and his staff watched the map with growing horror. The coloured pins representing German units were moving at an alarming rate, and the pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't a frontal assault on Kiev. This was a massive encirclement. On September 11th, Kirponos sent an urgent telegram to Moscow requesting permission to withdraw the front eastward out of the developing pocket. The response came back within hours, signed by Stalin himself. Hold your positions. Withdrawal is forbidden. Anyone who suggests abandoning Kiev is a defeatist and will be treated accordingly. The message was clear. Retreat was not just forbidden, it was potentially treasonous. Officers who pushed too hard for withdrawal risked arrest by the NKVD. But the situation continued to deteriorate. By September the 12th, the German pincers were driving deeper. Soviet units attempting to counterattack were brushed aside or encircled themselves. The flanks of the southwestern front were collapsing inward. For the Soviet soldiers on the ground, confusion reigned. Many units were still holding their original defensive positions, facing west toward the Germans they expected to attack from the front. They had no idea that German panzers were already dozens or even hundreds of kilometres behind them. Communication was breaking down. The Germans systematically targeted Soviet command posts, communication centres and radio stations. Many units lost contact with higher headquarters and with each other. Commanders made decisions based on fragmentary information or rumour. Some units, seeing what was happening, began to pull back without orders. Better to risk court-martial than certain death in an obvious trap. Other units held fast, following their orders with discipline, even as the situation around them disintegrated. September 15th, 1941, the day the trap closed, near the town of Lokhvitsa, about 150 kilometres east of Kiev, forward elements of Guderian's and Kleist's panzer groups made contact. German tank commanders and crews met on the road, shaking hands and celebrating. The encirclement was complete. Over 665,000 Soviet soldiers, 5 entire armies, were now trapped in a pocket roughly 200 kilometers across. It was the largest military encirclement in history. At Southwestern Front headquarters in Kiev, the maps told the story. They were surrounded. Every direction was now enemy territory, except for the shrinking space inside the pocket. Kuponos sent one more desperate message to Moscow. "We are encircled. Request permission for immediate breakout to the east." Stalin's response, when it finally came on September the 17th, was grudging and too late. "You may attempt withdrawal." By then, the German ring had solidified. Infantry divisions had moved up to reinforce the panzer units. Artillery was being positioned. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, attacking anything that moved. The trap had closed. Now it would tighten. For the men trapped inside the Kiev pocket, the next 10 days were a descent into hell. Imagine the situation. You are a Soviet soldier. Days ago, you were holding a defensive position, perhaps in a well-prepared trench or bunker, waiting for the Germans to attack from the west. Now suddenly, you are surrounded. The Germans are everywhere, north, south, east, west. Your supply lines have been cut. Your communications with higher command are sporadic or non-existent, and you have no idea what you're supposed to do. The German strategy was methodical. They had no intention of immediately assaulting into the pocket against desperate defenders. Instead, they would compress it systematically, using artillery and air power to pound Soviet positions, while infantry advanced slowly and methodically. The Luftwaffe flew constant missions over the pocket. Stukas dive-bombed concentrations of troops and vehicles. Medium bombers struck command posts and supply dumps. Fighters strafed columns of soldiers trying to move. The sky was the domain of the enemy, and there was no respite. Soviet anti-aircraft fire was initially fierce, but ammunition quickly became scarce. Guns fell silent not because their crews were dead, but because they had no shells to fire. Artillery was worse. German guns completely surrounded the pocket, and they fired from all directions. There was no safe area, no rear zone away from the front lines. Shells could land anywhere at any time. The psychological effect was devastating. Food became scarce within days. Supply dumps had been destroyed or captured. Foraging parties sent into villages found them already stripped of food by earlier retreating units or by the Germans. Some soldiers went days without a proper meal. Water was a constant problem. The September weather was warm, and men labouring under fire grew desperately thirsty. Rivers and streams were contested areas. Men died trying to fill canteens. Ammunition was perhaps the most critical shortage. Soviet doctrine relied heavily on massed artillery and automatic weapons fire, but now shells and bullets were running out. Soldiers began to hoard ammunition, knowing that when they fired their last rounds, they would have nothing left but surrender or death. And medical care collapsed. Hospitals and aid stations were overwhelmed with wounded. Supplies of morphine, bandages, and antiseptics ran out. Doctors performed amputations without anesthesia. Men died of wounds that would have been survivable with proper treatment. The psychological state of the trapped men varied enormously. Some units maintained remarkable discipline and cohesion. Officers kept their men organised, rationed supplies carefully, and prepared for breakout attempts. These units would fight with determination when the time came. Other units disintegrated. Men deserted their posts and fled into the forests, hoping to escape on their own. Political officers, the Zampolits, tried to maintain morale through Communist Party rhetoric, but many soldiers were beyond caring about ideology. They just wanted to survive. Some units received orders to attempt breakouts. These operations were desperate affairs, usually conducted at night. Soldiers would form up in columns and attempt to smash through the German encirclement ring at a weak point. A few such breakouts succeeded. Small groups of men, sometimes led by determined officers, fought their way through German positions and escaped into the forests beyond. They would spend days or weeks making their way east, avoiding German patrols, living off the land until they reached Soviet lines. But most breakout attempts failed. German positions were stronger than they appeared. Minefields blocked routes of escape. Machine guns cut down advancing soldiers. Those who made it through the first line of defences often found second and third lines waiting, and always the pocket grew smaller. Day by day, the Germans compressed the encirclement. Soviet units were pushed back, packed more and more tightly together. What had been a pocket 200 kilometres across on September 15th was perhaps 50 kilometres across by September 20th. September 19th, 1941. Kiev itself fell. German forces entered the city from multiple directions. The Soviet garrison, cut off and outnumbered, fought from street to street, building to building. By evening, the swastika flag flew over the city centre. The loss of Kiev was a psychological blow to the men still trapped in the pocket. If the capital they had been defending had fallen, what were they still fighting for? General Mikhail Kirponos was a competent and professional officer trapped in an impossible situation. Born in 1892, Kirponos had served in the Imperial Russian Army during World War I, then joined the Red Army during the Civil War. He survived the purges of the late 1930s and was given command of the Leningrad Military District, then the Southwestern Front. Unlike some of Stalin's commanders, he was not a political appointee. He was a real soldier. And unlike Stalin, Kirponos had seen the disaster coming. For weeks he had warned Moscow of the danger. He had requested permission to withdraw. He had accurately assessed the German plan, but he had been overruled at every turn, and now he was trapped with his armies. By September 18th, with Kiev about to fall and the pocket contracting, Kirponos made the decision to attempt a breakout. He gathered his staff and the remnants of several units near the village of Shumakovo, about 40 kilometres east of Kiev. The plan was to break through the German ring and escape to the east. It was a desperate gamble. The force attempting the breakout was small, perhaps a few thousand soldiers, the remnants of headquarters units, guards, and whoever else could be gathered. They were short on ammunition, food, and supplies. They were exhausted, but staying meant certain death or capture. On the night of September 19th to 20th, the breakout began. The column moved through the forests under cover of darkness. For a time, it seemed they might succeed. They slipped between German positions, moving as quietly as possible. But on the morning of September 20th, near the village of Shenderovka, they ran into a German ambush. Accounts of what happened next are fragmentary. German troops opened fire with machine guns and mortars. The Soviet column scattered into the forest. Kirponos, his staff, and a group of soldiers attempted to fight their way through. General Kirponos was hit by machine gun fire or shell fragments. Accounts differ, and mortally wounded. His chief of staff, General Tupikov, and several other senior officers were killed in the same engagement. The column disintegrated. Some survivors managed to escape into the forests. A few eventually made it back to Soviet lines weeks later with the story of Kirponos's death. Others were captured or killed. Kirponos was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. He had done everything he could with an impossible situation. He had been a competent commander undone by strategic mistakes made far above his level. His death marked the effective end of organised resistance by the Southwestern Front. Individual units continued to fight for several more days, but without central command, their efforts were isolated and ultimately futile. September 26, 1941. The Battle of Kiev officially ended. The German Wehrmacht announced the capture of 665,000 Soviet prisoners, along with 884 tanks, 3,178 artillery pieces, and over 400 anti-aircraft guns. It was the largest encirclement and capture of enemy forces in military history, a record that still stands today. Soviet sources later disputed some of these figures. They argued that many of the prisoners counted by the Germans were actually civilians caught in the encirclement, or rear echelon personnel and support troops rather than combat soldiers. Some Western historians estimate the actual number of combat troops captured at closer to 450,000 to 500,000, with total casualties, killed, wounded, captured, for the battle at around 616,000 to 700,000. Regardless of the exact numbers, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. 4 entire Soviet armies, the 5th, 21st, 26th, and 37th, had been completely destroyed. The 38th Army had suffered catastrophic losses. The Southwestern Front as a functioning military organisation ceased to exist. The human stories behind these statistics are staggering. Consider hundreds of thousands of men who woke up on September 1st as soldiers of the Red Army were, by September the 26th, either dead or prisoners of war. Thousands of junior officers, lieutenants, captains, majors, who had led their men with courage, were killed or captured. Families across Ukraine and Russia received the dreaded notification: missing in action, presumed captured or killed. Entire units, sometimes raised from the same regions, were wiped out together. For those who were captured, the ordeal was far from over. The German treatment of Soviet POWs was among the worst war crimes of World War II. Considered subhuman by Nazi ideology, Soviet prisoners were deliberately starved, worked to death, or shot. Of the millions of Soviet soldiers captured during the war, roughly 3.3 million died in German captivity, a death rate of about 58%. Many of the men captured at Kiev would not survive to see liberation in 1945. They would die in camps from starvation, disease, exposure, or execution. Those who did survive often faced suspicion and persecution when they returned to the Soviet Union. Stalin's regime treated former POWs as potential traitors who had allowed themselves to be captured rather than fighting to the death. The material losses were also staggering. The Southwestern Front had possessed thousands of artillery pieces, hundreds of tanks and aircraft, tens of thousands of vehicles, and vast quantities of small arms and supplies. Almost all of it was lost. These were resources the Soviet Union could not quickly replace, despite its vast size and industrial capacity. The territorial consequences were equally serious. With the Southwestern Front destroyed, Ukraine lay open to German occupation. The Germans would seize vast quantities of grain, coal, and industrial equipment. They would occupy cities and towns, impressing the population into forced labour or shipping them to Germany as slave workers. The Battle of Kiev was the worst military disaster in Soviet history, and one of the most preventable. In the aftermath, bitter questions were asked. How could such a catastrophe have been allowed to happen? Who was responsible? The answer ultimately pointed to the highest levels of Soviet leadership. Stalin's refusal to authorize a timely withdrawal had doomed the Southwestern Front. His insistence on holding every metre of Soviet soil, regardless of the strategic situation, had cost the Red Army hundreds of thousands of men it desperately needed. But from disaster came lessons. After Kiev, Soviet military doctrine began to change. The Red Army became more willing to trade space for time. Commanders were granted more authority to make tactical withdrawals when faced with encirclement. The rigid, politicized command structure that had contributed to the disaster was gradually reformed. Stalin himself learned, though the lesson came at a terrible cost. He began to listen more to his professional military commanders, men like Zhukov, who had been proven right about Kiev. When the Germans reached the gates of Moscow in late 1941, Stalin authorized withdrawals and strategic retreats when necessary. The time bought by the defenders of Kiev, though purchased at a horrific price, was not entirely wasted. While the Wehrmacht was engaged in Ukraine, the Soviet Union was frantically mobilizing its resources. Factories were being evacuated east of the Urals, beyond German reach. New armies were being raised and trained. The logistical and industrial foundation for eventual victory was being laid. And critically, the Germans had lost time. The weeks spent encircling and destroying the southwestern front were weeks not spent advancing on Moscow. When Army Group Center finally turned its full attention back to the Soviet capital in October, precious time had been lost. The autumn rains arrived, turning roads to mud. Then winter came, and with it, the end of German hopes for a quick victory. For the Soviet soldiers who fought at Kiev, the battle remains a story of courage amidst catastrophe. They were brave men, let down by their leadership, but not by their own determination. Many fought to their last bullet. Others endured the hell of German captivity. Some escaped and continued the fight. Today, memorials mark the sites where they fought and died. The forests and fields around Kiev, now peaceful, once echoed with the thunder of artillery and the cries of the wounded. The city they defended so desperately is now the capital of an independent Ukraine, a nation born from the wreckage of the Soviet Union they died defending. The Battle of Kiev reminds us that war is not just about grand strategy and moving arrows on maps. It is about human beings, soldiers who follow orders, even bad ones, commanders who do their best with impossible situations, and leaders whose mistakes cost not just battles, but lives. 665,000 lives lost in 2 weeks, the largest encirclement in military history, a preventable disaster that became a painful lesson. We remember them not just as numbers, but as men who stood and fought when their country called, even when that call led them into a trap from which there was no escape. Thank you for watching this documentary on the Battle of Kiev, 1941, from the Soviet perspective. Please like, subscribe and share if you found this video informative. Let me know in the comments what other Eastern Front battles you'd like to see covered in depth.